Hello, it's Thursday, August the 6th, and we continue our journey toward Sunday, the 10th Sunday after Pentecost, August the 9th, 2020. And today we conclude this week's mini Bible series by looking at the Gospel for Sunday, which is Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33. So let me begin by reading for you the introduction to the Gospel, and then sharing with you some of my reflections on what I think it's telling us. Matthew's Gospel typically portrays Jesus' disciples as people of little faith, who fail despite their best intentions. In this story, Matthew shows how Jesus comes to the disciples when they are in trouble and sustains them in their time of fear and doubt. Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side of the Sea of Galilee while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The story of Jesus walking on the water is so well known. I'm sure you've heard it many times. In fact, it generates art and humor even from outside of the church. These days, the expression "walks on water" identifies a person with extraordinary skills or extraordinary talents. In another example, a cartoon shows two men on the shore watching Jesus walk across the water, and one man says to the other, "You just have to know where the rocks are." A favorite painting of many depicts a very serene Jesus on a relatively calm sea, larger than life, feet just a little bit higher than the surface of the water, perfectly white robes, dry and puffed slightly as if by a gentle breeze. That's not what the gospel says. These interpretations, art and humor, they provide us an insight into the things that we find meaningful, as well as the things that we find troubling in this gospel. This gospel that we call Jesus walking on the water. Danger and fear fill this story. Jesus sent the disciples ahead by boat to go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, while he went up onto a mountain to be by himself, to pray. By evening, the boat was assaulted by waves. The Greek literally translates as tortured or tormented, harassed. It indicates severe distress. The boat is far away from land. The wind is against them. The Greek adjective for against suggests that there was hostility in the wind. And the translation of it, the wind being against them, seems a little too soft. It sounds like they were just having a little bit of trouble with the sails. That does not capture the perilous danger of the situation in which the disciples find themselves in today's gospel. We might call to mind the tropical storm or the level 1 hurricane that swept across the Caribbean islands and came up the east coast this past weekend. In the first century Jewish world, they may have called to mind the chaotic waters of creation, or even the rain and rising waters of the story of Noah and the ark. Those of us who have experienced the severity of wind and rain and crashing waves can understand the fear that the disciples felt. While the Sea of Galilee is no ocean, it is also known for how quickly dangerous winds and storms can come sweeping down out of the mountains and across the lake. This scene is not to be interpreted as Jesus just taking a casual stroll across the rocks and the water while the disciples are having a little bit of problem with the sails. This scene is a long night of battle for their lives. The disciples were understandably afraid. When they saw Jesus walking toward them in their fear, they're terrified even further. They don't recognize him. They're living out of fear, and they cry out in fear, and Jesus says, "It is I." And interestingly in the Greek, he addresses their fear by reversing it and says, "Fear not." Do not be afraid. Language like that. These are words of divine assurance in the middle of danger or fear when there is a good reason to be afraid. Peter. Not surprisingly, it's Peter who takes a leap of faith and steps out of the boat to walk on the water toward Jesus, and he discovers quickly Jesus' words of assurance did not mean the dangerous wind and waves would disappear. And he does walk on the water for a few steps. And then his focus changes, and he's once again frightened. There is danger for his life once again. Good reason to be frightened. He began to sink into the turbulent sea. How often do we want Jesus to make the trouble disappear rather than have Jesus ask us to trust him in the middle of the trouble? Peter plays a central role in today's gospel, as he often does in the Gospels, and our attention shifts from Jesus to Peter doing his own water walking. Ultimately, Peter sinks, afraid for his life. Jesus' response to Peter after rescuing him implies that Peter's failure was due to a lack of faith. So, are we to conclude that Peter would have succeeded if only he had a little more faith? Or maybe because he had a moment of doubt? That is an unsettling conclusion for disciples of any century, including us. This gospel is often used to encourage more faith, or to have the courage to step out of the boat. And I think that teaching alone dismisses the disciples' real danger and justifiable fear in today's gospel. Think back a few years ago. How many of us were afraid and prayed a lot for safety when Hurricane Irma covered the entire state of Florida. There was no one getting away from that hurricane. Sometimes the best approach to understanding the gospel is to resist the temptation to resolve or to overlook the anxieties and allow room for the gospel story to disturb us. Yes, I said, allow it to disturb us. One of the cliches when I was in seminary was that there are times when the gospel is meant to unsettle the comfortable. At times, Christians can become so comfortable that we become complacent. And there are some gospels that give us a wake-up call of sorts. At least 4 of these disciples were professional sailors. They were fishermen. They probably could have gotten through this storm without Jesus' help. It's an educated guess on my part that this was not their first storm that they ever encountered. And they could have fought against the wind and the waves, and they probably would have made it to the other side safely. Although they would have been exhausted, battered and bruised. They would have climbed out of the boat onto the dry land, possibly falling onto the sand, laying on their backs, breathing heavy, and just plain grateful to be alive. Have you ever gone through something perilous? Something that could easily have killed you, yet you survived? And it feels kind of like a miracle to still be alive. I have, frankly, on more than one occasion. The details of those stories are not as relevant as the end of the story. I look back at what happened, and the only explanation I have for still being here is that the Lord was with me. Or, in some cases, me and my whole family. I know people will scoff. People will dismiss it as just being lucky. That's okay with me. People naturally look for reasons to rationalize whatever they cannot otherwise explain or accept on faith. I do not think that this gospel is meant for us to focus on Peter's failure, or at least not Peter's failure of faith. That being said, I think there is always a general kind of encouragement within God's Word for us to grow in our faith. And that's the second part of our mission statement here at Redeemer. I think we do that by studying God's Word rather than trying to perform our own miracles, like attempting to walk on water. I think our focus for this gospel reading can be realizing that there are times in our lives when we will be justifiably afraid, and to not beat ourselves up for any perceived lack of faith. This gospel can teach us that even in the middle of danger and fear, there is peace in the presence of Christ. And there is promise that the turbulent waters will subside at some point. Thank you again for joining me today and for this journey that we've been on this week as we prepare for August the 9th, 2020, the 10th Sunday after Pentecost. Have a great day. God bless.